Hello there and welcome to Dr. Whickman's Literary Top Tips. This is the second part. Today I said I was going to do talk about poetry, and this is going to be sort of an introduction to poetry. Before I start, I just want to say thank you very much for those who've given their kind comments and pointers as to things I can incorporate into this week. Now one of them was that I need to have sort of more interesting visuals. So we'll see what happens this week. It might work out okay, it might not. But one of the first things you'll notice is you can see I've got this Blake print on my wall. And it's called The Great Red Dragon and the Woman Clothed with the Sun. It's from Blake's images that he did for the Book of Revelation. You also might be familiar with that image from the film Red Dragon. But anyway, you might think I'm obviously a bit of a lunatic to have that on the wall in my front room, but there we go. Also, some people have asked me about some of the comments I made towards the end of the video last week, in particular, about what texts I feel should be on a literature course and which texts should be on what I called a cultural studies course, and I will address that sort of issue in a later vlog. I'm going to have a discussion about canon formation and things like that. So today I'm going to focus on, I think, three areas when introducing poetry. So the first part, we're going to look at, I'm going to offer a kind of a polemic of looking into why people are turned off by poetry, and also perhaps critiquing how people have taught poetry in the past. It's probably the biggest battle that we have as HE lecturers, is trying to get students to engage with poetry. So that's be the first part. It might sort of ruffle a few feathers in my comments in that. The second part will kind of look at these principles that I think are worthy of study, and we'll kind of look at some examples. And then if we have time, I'll perhaps look into the sonnet. Now the sonnet is quite this is quite a common form to make use of when talking about poetry, sort of offering an introduction. So that's the plan. See how we get on with that. Okay then, so let's start with some basic principles of poetry. Now, I don't want to patronise you. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the idea that poetry doesn't have to rhyme. I mean, generally poetry rhymes, and we're going to discuss rhyme at some point in this video. But anyway, poetry doesn't have to rhyme. So what I'm going to do to start off with, I'm going to read a passage from Milton's Paradise Lost, and there's a couple of reasons why I've chosen this particular poem and this particular passage. I was going to choose a different passage, but I thought I'd go for this one. One of the reasons is because I mentioned Milton last week and compared him to a car manual, but also there are a couple of other reasons, and we'll get to that in a minute. It's also dead good, and you should all read it. So this is one of Satan's speeches, and it contains quite a few lines that are very famous, even if you're not that familiar with the poem itself. Now, I hope I don't balls it up, because this is like the third take of reading this out. So anyway, so this is Satan. He's just sort of, coming to terms with the fact that him and his followers are condemned to live in this place called hell, which isn't quite as nice as heaven, basically. "Is this the region, this the soil, the clime," said then the lost archangel, "this the seat that we must change for heaven, this mournful gloom for that celestial light? Be it so, since he who now is sovereign can dispose and bid what shall be right. Farthest from him is best, whom reason hath equalled, force hath made supreme above his equals. Farewell, happy fields where joy for ever dwells. Hail, horrors! Hail, infernal world! And thou, profoundest hell, receive thy new possessor. One who brings a mind not to be changed by place or time. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. What matter where, if I be still the same, and what I should be all but less than he whom thunder hath made greater. Here at least we shall be free. The Almighty hath not built here for his envy, will not drive us hence. Here we may reign secure, and in my choice to reign is worth ambition though in hell. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. But wherefore let we then our faithful friends, the associates and co-partners of our loss, lie thus astonished on the oblivious pool, and call them not to share with us their part in this unhappy mansion, or once more with rallied arms to try what may be yet regained in heaven, or what more lost in hell. Okay, so if you disagree with me that that's not a very good passage, you're wrong for a start. But anyway, you can clearly see that it's a very beautiful work of literary art. There's a particular reason I chose this passage. It's a passage from one of the most famous poems in the English language, but it's perhaps the most famous example of what is known as a blank verse poem. As you'll notice from me reading it out, that it doesn't rhyme. And that's quite a crucial point. So, bearing that in mind, this poem that doesn't rhyme, it's clearly artistic and it's clearly sort of beautiful. And where does the sort of seeming music of the lines come from if it doesn't rhyme? It's not as simple as saying, well, it's got pretty words in and they're arranged in a certain way. Well, yes, they're arranged in a certain way. But the music of the lines comes from something called meter. Meter is essentially the sort of the rhythm of each line. Students often fail to understand what meter is, I think, or really they sort of know what it is in an abstract way, but don't really see how it applies to a particular poem. And I often think it's taught badly as well. People make meter or metrical craft a kind of really complicated technical thing, when really it's just like, it's what the line sounds like, really. I mean, it's as simple as that. So I mentioned this example of blank verse poetry. What blank verse poetry is unrhymed, as we mentioned, but it has actually quite a rigid meter. So, you know, sort of order of lines. And the meter is iambic pentameter. Now, that's probably the most famous meter of them all, and it's one that you're very familiar with from, say, your GCSE English. You know, the type of writing that Shakespeare was engaging in many of his plays. He uses iambic pentameter. Okay, so you know what iambic pentameter is. You've come across that term before, but have you really grasped what that involves? So let's break that phrase, iambic pentameter, down. If we look at a famous line of iambic pentameter, I'm going to use a line from Shakespeare. I often use this line. It's the opening line of the character Macbeth in the play Macbeth, and his famous line is, "So foul and fair a day I have not seen." Okay, it has a kind of music to it, it has a kind of rhythm to it, and it's a great example of iambic pentameter. If you count the syllables in that line, so foul and fair a day I have not seen, you'll notice it's got 10 syllables. However, if you remember primary school and when you used to talk about shapes and things like that, or you know your Latin and Greek or whatever, you'll say to yourself, but pentameter, pentagon, doesn't pent refer to 5 rather than 10? Okay. Well, the pent bit on pentameter refers to 5 pairs of syllables. Okay, so the line, so foul and fair a day I have not seen, is made up of 10 syllables. That is true. But actually, it's made up of 5 pairs of syllables. Okay, so the pent refers to pairs, 5 pairs of syllables. These paired syllables are known, and it doesn't really matter. You don't often need to know this in you know, standard reading of poetry, but those paired syllables are known as feet, or singular is a foot, so a metrical foot they're called. So pentameter is made up of 5 metrical feet, 5 paired syllables. Okay, straightforward. But how are they paired? How do we know how to pair the syllables with each other? That's what the first bit, iambic, refers to. Iambic refers to the nature of those pairs. It describes what they're like, okay, and describes what the pairs are made up of. And iambic simply means unstressed and then stressed. Okay, so an iamb, the singular is an iamb, the noun. I can say a single iamb is a foot. So remember, a metrical foot that is made up of one unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. Okay, now I'll show you this with the line. I'll sort of read it out, and then I'll sort of emphasize this with an image. So foul and fair a day I have not seen. Okay, so that's emphasizing the stressed syllables in that line. There's an element of subjectivity, in a sense, of what syllables are stressed or not. And this is particularly the case when it's like a dramatic text like Shakespeare, because an actor might put different stresses on different lines. But really, that's how you speak. So foul and fair a day I have not seen. You speak unstressed and stressed syllables, generally. But you then, you might stress in different ways. Just give an example. The point is the meter, the rhythm of the line, comes from the relationship of the syllables with each other rather than what they're like on their own. Okay, so just as an example, the word I in that passage, in another context that could be stressed, couldn't it? It could be a stressed syllable, but it would sound weird in this context. So foul and fair a day I have not seen. It would sound ridiculous. It doesn't make sense. So foul and fair a day I have not seen. Okay. In this example at the moment, when I'm sort of reading it out to you, I am purposefully stressing the syllables. But if I just to make a point, but you don't have to do that with meter. It's just the flow of the lines. Why does it sound good? Because it's been arranged in this certain way. That's what meter is, essentially. Iambic pentameter is... So pentameter refers to 5 pairs of metrical feet. Okay, 5 pairs of metrical feet, therefore creating 10 syllables. Iambic refers to the nature of those pairs, which are unstressed syllable and then stressed syllable. I will illustrate this now on the screen. So foul and fair a day I have not seen. Hopefully that makes sense. And it hasn't taken me that long, I don't think, to explain essentially a very basic premise of pentameter. Because I think this is something that a lot of students really struggle with, and I don't think it's often taught very well. So I'm going to make another case. So that's sort of a basic starting point about poetry, about the importance of meter. I'm going to also make another case now, which might ruffle a few feathers, which is talking about teaching of poetry and how to teach students to read it. There's a famous poem by Wordsworth called The Tables Turned, and it's in his lyrical ballads. Well, his and Coleridge's lyrical ballads. Everyone always forgets poor old Coleridge. And he's got this great line, which is, "We murder to dissect." So the poem Tables Turned is about, I'll put a link to it down below. It's sort of like, it starts off with, "Up, up, my friends, and quit your books." So the idea is, there's a certain irony, the fact it's a poem, of course, but the idea is he's instructing, the poet is instructing his friend to get out in the world and experience things rather than just sort of read about it. But anyway, that line, "We murder to dissect." I think one of the problems with sort of a lot of teaching of poetry is it gets turned into a very technical thing. you kill it in order to dissect it. Dissect being a sort of scientific term, really. We don't really think of it as scientific, but it kind of is dissecting something. And we murder it, we kill it, kill our passion for something. And I think that's certainly been the case when I was learning about poetry in my first year of undergraduate. What often happens is a lot of lecturers and people like that sort of give you a list of rhetorical devices and Renaissance Latinate phrasing, and then tell you what these effects are, and then they show you a poem and get you to look at a poem and say, apply what you know about these Renaissance rhetorical terms that will never be used again ever, and see if you can find them in the poem. So I thought I was doing an English literature degree here, but in fact you're doing this sort of weird rhetoric class. And you never really that doesn't really teach you to feel the poetry in the first place. The best way to learn is to read it and think, this interesting effect. Wonder what this is called. That's the best way to learn. And hopefully we'll see me sort of making some half-assed attempt today to do that. I want to point out that when I say you need to feel it, that I don't mean it in a wishy-washy way. I mean, I want to, students to get the sense of, okay, this poem has a nice effect. This is strange. Wonder what this does. I wonder what this is called. So basically, essentially, what I'm advocating is essentially teaching poetry in the reverse of how I described, which is not starting with here are the list of rhetorical devices, apply them to the poem. It's, here's a poem, what's strange about it? Let's look into what's strange about it. That's how you teach how to read poetry. Okay, so what I want to do now is show you how you don't necessarily need to know the terminology to actually have a good stab at reading a poem. So simply, you look at a poem and see what's strange about it. So Professor Catherine Belsey, the very important literary critic and theorist who's visiting professor at the University of Derby, came in to do a workshop with our students. And she used this poem by Wordsworth, very famous. It's called "A Slumber Did My Spirit Seal." And it's useful for our purposes now because it's very short and it's also very rich and quite a beautiful poem. So I'll read it out now and I'll put the image on the screen. A slumber did my spirit seal. I had no human fears. She seemed a thing that could not feel the touch of earthly years. No motion has she now, no force. She neither hears nor sees. Rolled round in earth's diurnal course, with rocks and stones and trees. Now essentially, what Professor Belsey got our students to do was simply just look at the poem and she asked them a few questions about it, like, what's strange about this poem, essentially. And so you don't have to know, you don't really have to have a particular arsenal of terminology to know what to look for, really. You just look for what strikes you, what's particularly beautiful about the poem. I mean, I always get sort of the shiver down my spine in this poem because it's a beautiful and very morbid poem. Coleridge famously said of it that it was Wordsworth imagining the death of his sister. I think it was with this poem, but it might be another. So anyway, it's a very peculiar but sort of very important poem. So let's look at this and what's a bit odd. What strikes you? Sometimes you don't notice this with just the first reading. A slumber did my spirit seal. It's an odd opening line for a start. I had no human fears. She seemed a thing that could not feel the touch of earthly years. So, first stanza. One thing that might help you is look at the qualifiers. The particular qualifying adjectives, for instance. So in the second line, I had no human fears. Okay, so these fears are human then. Okay, that might be important. Let's contrast this I figure, because there are two seeming characters in this poem, aren't they? The I and this female she figure who appears to be dead. Let's contrast this human I with the female figure. She seemed a thing that could not feel. So a thing. That's quite striking, isn't it? Contrasted with human. You might want to do something like that with that. Human versus thing. The human and the non-human. In the second stanza, you might look at, no motion has she now, no force. She neither hears nor sees. Rolled round in earth's diurnal course with rocks and stones and trees. Now, she supposedly has no motion, right? But then she's rolled round earth's diurnal course. So, does she have motion or not? Okay, so that's another sort of thing you might want to highlight. Something else, the tip that I often throw to my students is pounce on words like seem or like, because that seem and like are nicely ambiguous words in many ways. So seem, if something seems like something, that generally means it's not actually like it at all. Similarly, if I say that a person is like another person, through that comparison, saying they are like that, you're actually emphasizing the difference between them, aren't you? They're not. If someone's like someone else, they're clearly not that person. And so that those are words worth jumping on. Seem and like. Seemed is a bit different to like, because seem suggests, oh, I don't have the full picture. Maybe from what I could gather, she seemed this, but maybe if I'd seen all of her, I could definitely be sure. But there is that kind of, so that contrast we brought up between the human and the sort of the thing is immediately problematized, isn't it? Is she actually this thing, or is she, or is it just seems to be like this thing? Okay. You also might want to touch upon, going back to the line, she seemed a thing that could not feel. She seemed a thing that could not feel. And then later on, she neither hears nor sees. Well, she doesn't feel anymore, does she? Okay, so you want to draw comparisons to that. Other things you might want to draw attention to, which we're going to get onto now, are the rhymes. Okay, so we'll come back to that in a minute. So what I've just shown you there, I haven't given you interpretation of the poem at all. I've just sort of said things you might want to look at. What's strange about it? What words strike you? What qualifiers are interesting? What ambiguities are there? What double meanings do we have for particular phrases? What does it mean to be rolled around in earth's diurnal course? Where's the agency in this poem? Is there any agency? Who's in charge? Who is the female figure in control of her actions? She rolled round by the earth, or does she have motion in another way? So these are things you can think of. So I haven't given you this an interpretation. I simply highlighted things that you might think are interesting to look at. And notice you don't need any sort of particular skills or knowledge of terminology to do that. Okay, so as you can tell by my slightly different coloured t-shirt and the slightly different placing of the camera, you can tell this was recorded at a different time to the other parts of the video. I did mention at the start I was going to have this sort of a discussion about sonnets and things like that, but that will probably have to wait for a follow-up video, because I realise this is getting on for half an hour now, which I think is the utmost limit for these sorts of videos. Just to clarify a few things. Firstly, my sort of criticism of terminology when teaching poetry is not to dismiss it entirely at all, not at all. It's merely wanting practitioners to think about how they teach poetry and how to stop people being turned off by it. I don't think I've given a very good example with my sort of introduction using "A slumber did my spirit seal." I think I mangled that quite badly, and I do apologise, but it did take quite a bit of time to edit that section, and I'm not sure I can be bothered to go back and revisit that. But any comments on my suggestions about terminology below would be great. I mean, do you think that I'm wrong on this? Do you think that it's a good idea to have the kind of so-called tools in order to read poetry in advance, or not? So I mentioned that I wanted to do something about rhyme. So in that Wordsworth poem, that you might want something that's often ignored, I think, when reading poetry is often what words rhyme with each other. Sometimes it's regarded as simply an aesthetic thing, like that it sounds good that we have this rhyme scheme. But often rhyme is doing more than this, and sometimes rhyme, as we'll see a bit more next week when we look at sonnets and things like that, it can sort of situate something in a tradition. Okay, so poetry doesn't have to rhyme, but what I want us to think about is how rhyme is not something old-fashioned or quaint, that it has interesting effects in many ways, and it can function in a variety of ways. I'll read you now a passage from an 18th century poem. It's by Jonathan Swift, as the famous satirist, and we'll probably talk more about Swift in a future episode, hopefully, because he's bloody funny actually, and he's a really great writer, very interesting figure. I think is very fascinating. But anyway, so this poem is called "The Lady's Dressing Room." It's perhaps one of the most canonical of Swift's poems, and it's quite familiar to a lot of people. And it's also very rude and kind of disgusting. But what I want to talk about with this poem is a poem that's written in iambic tetrameter. So tetrameter, as opposed to pentameter, is essentially 8-syllable lines, 4 metrical feet, as opposed to iambic pentameter, 10-syllable lines, 5 metrical feet. Okay. But not on every line though. Sometimes lines have an extra syllable here and there. That's kind of important. But one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this is it rhymes a lot. This is very common for poems of the period, and we'll discuss why again in a future episode, perhaps specifically about the 18th century. And what I wanted to show you here is how rhyme can sometimes be used for satirical effect, like it can do something. So, just a bit of context. The poem called "The Lady's Dressing Room" describes this guy called Strephon who goes into this lady's dressing room after she's left, and you assume it's this woman he kind of fancies a bit called Celia. She's the goddess Celia. And then he goes into this dressing room, which is a bit of a mess, really, and then he describes what he sees. And what he sees are all these disgusting things, like, discarded, as you can imagine, like discarded makeup, and even a toilet, or the contents of a toilet bowl. And that sort of realizing that Celia is not this beautiful goddess after all, she's actually does all these disgusting things as well. He's put off women forever. Now, the poem's often read as either kind of misogynist or actually being sort of more complex than that. So I'm trying to find a passage here. I think I'm going to use this one. Okay. So this particular passage, which I'll put on the screen in a minute, is describing Strephon discovering this water closet in the corner, and then opening it, and discovering that Celia does indeed excrete. What's sort of masterful about this passage is just the sort of the structure, how he sort of lengthens this whole, how Swift sort of lengthens this whole passage, and also the imagery is fantastic here. But I want to show you some of the what I'm getting at. As mutton cutlets, prime of meat, which, though with art you salt and beat, as laws of cookery require, and toast them at the clearest fire, if from adown the hopeful chops the fat upon a cinder drops, to stinking smoke it turns the flame, poisoning the flesh from whence it came, and up exhales a greasy stench, for which you curse the careless wench. So things, which must not be expressed, when plumped into the reeking chest, send up an excremental smell to taint the parts from whence they fell. The petticoats and gown perfume which waft a stink round every room. Thus finishing his grand survey, disgusted Strephon stole away, repeating in his amorous fits, "Oh, Celia, Celia, Celia shits." Okay, so what rhyme can do is it can essentially speed up your experience of a poem. Because what happens is when you sort of start reading a poem and then you realise that the rhyme that it rhymes, and perhaps it's made up of rhyming couplets, as this poem is, you read it and then you kind of get to the rhyming word and then the last word of the line and then sort of get to the next rhyming word quite quickly. In this poem, because it's iambic tetrameter, there are only 8 syllables between one rhyme at the end of the line and then the next line at the end of the next line. So that contrasts, so there are 2 fewer syllables compared to, say, if it was an iambic pentameter, heroic couplets poem, which we'll get onto on a later episode. So that's worth noting. You know, it sort of rhyme can help create this kind of sense of pace. And Swift uses this in an interesting way. So not only does the passage kind of has this interesting pace, he manipulates punctuation or lack of to do this. You might want to look at the enjambment in this passage. So enjambment, if you try and remember back to school, is when you don't have punctuation on the end of a line and it just flows on to the next. So notice that when I read it out, and this is worth noting, it seems like an obvious thing, you don't stop at the end of a line when reading poetry. You only stop if the punctuation tells you to. Okay, otherwise you just continue going. This is something that people always get wrong with poetry. They read it line by line rather than as a whole. Okay, so that's important note. Also, what rhyme helps to do, as well as create a sort of pace, it creates a sense of anticipation. And that's often used very well for satiric effects. So in this passage, amorous fits rhymes with Celia, Celia, Celia shits. So fits and shits. So when you get to amorous fits, you're like, I wonder what rhymes with fits. And that's kind of, you almost start laughing before it gets to the word. And amorous fits as well, there's a nice contrast. You can draw a contrast between the sort of Anglo-Saxon shits and the sort of Latinate kind of highbrow amorous fits. And that's what Swift's kind of doing quite masterfully in this poem. And of course, so you can rhyme, which creates a sort of a sense of expectation and anticipation of what comes next, which can be kind of funny. And you can also frustrate that in other sense. Okay, I think we'll revisit this in another session. So what I want to do now is show you a great passage from Byron, who of course was very good at manipulating this very short rhyming couplet from Byron's Don Juan, and it's called Don Juan for a reason, and we'll not describe now why that is. But, oh, ye lords of ladies intellectual, inform us truly, have they not henpectual? Now, in many ways, that rhyme is sort of atrocious, but it's sort of knowingly bad, and the comedy comes from the sort of the failing of the line to be an effective rhyme. Like it's sort of very forced and silly. But what rhyme can also do is it can take you in different directions, and this is something that we'll definitely come back to, certainly when we're going to talk about sonnets and stuff next week. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and it has been a bit rambly and disjointed. I do apologise for that. Things will improve once I've decided finalised the format very much. Any comments, please put them below, and see you again soon.